everyone, for Chapter 6, we will go over the skeletal system, the components and structure of a bone, microscopic view of the bone, formation of bones, what are the processes involved, and bone's role in blood calcium regulation, and the bone diseases, some examples of them, and type of injuries that can occur. So let's get started. And now we won't go over the identification of specific bones by names for this chapter. This chapter focuses on all those stuff I was talking about. We'll save the identification of names of bones in the lab portion in the skeletal system lab. Okay. So the skeletal system is basically made up of bones, cartilages, ligaments, and other connective tissues that either stabilize or interconnect bones. So a lot of times, especially in the areas of joints, we need a lot of stabilization by the ligaments, which binds and joins bones to bones. It's kind of like ropes that wraps around the joints to stabilize the structure so that, slight impact, we won't move the bone out of place unless it's a very strong impact. Okay, we'll discuss more about the joints sort of components of the joints when we get to chapter 9, the next chapter. So here are some general functions of our skeletal system. So, as we already know it, the skeletal system serves as the structural framework of the body, and it actually serves as attachment of soft tissues and organs and also protection of them. Our bones will store minerals for us in forms of inorganic ions, mainly calcium ions as calcium salts. They will also store lipids as energy source in the yellow marrow of the bones. So this is where they will store extra energy reserve within that portion of the bone. Now, in the red marrow of bones, there are also blood stem cells called hematopoietic stem cells that will produce red blood cells and white blood cells throughout our lives. But we won't talk about this process in detail, but just know that there is red marrow within the medullary cavity of the bones for these processes to occur. And we'll talk about the details of this process in AMP2 in the blood chapter. Now, the structure of bones also serves as protection for our soft tissues, such as those in our thoracic cavity, that's how our ribs is covering up and protecting is mainly our lungs and our heart, so that, any small impact or mechanical shock will not harm our soft, delicate organs, and our bones sort of, gives that extra protection against those mechanical damages. Now, of course, if it's too big of an impact, it will, our bones will crack and cause damages, but at least it will protect us from some sort of mechanical shock. Now, we won't go over too much about leverage. This is a concept in either Chapter 7 or 8. Chapter 7 and 8 kind of mainly focuses on identification of bone names, your axial and appendicular skeleton. We're not skipping them. It's just that they're mainly about identification, and hence that's why we go from Chapter 6 here and then to Chapter 9 of the joints. We're saving the identification parts for the lab purposes. But it does mention the one small concept about leverage, which talks about the proportion in sizes of our bones around joints and how they play a role in magnitude and direction of forces that can be generated by these skeletal muscles. It's kind of like the torque and how that particular balance work in terms of physics, kind of like physics, okay? The torque that can be generated from certain points of leverage. But since, this is something we don't go back to and visit, this is as much as that concept we'll go over about leverage. Okay, other than their individual names, bone can be classified by 6 general shapes as well, and these are the 6 general shapes: sutural bones, flat bones, irregular bones, long bones, short bones, and sesamoid bones. Sutural bones are those that have these oddly shaped that kind of fits together like jigsaw puzzle. It's like the different cranium bones, parietal bones, occipital bones, how they fit together is because of the existence of these different sutures, sutural bones within that area. Okay, irregular bones are, as the name suggests, they are irregular shapes. So they have some flat area, like for example, the vertebral bone of the back. They have some short notches area, ridged area like that. So it doesn't have one particular shape. It has, a little bit of everything. So that's why we call them irregular bones. So vertebral bones is one of those examples, and also the pelvic bone right here is another example of irregular bones. Flat bones, on the other hand, are, as the name suggests, it has flat, it's mostly flat. Okay, so they have this thin sort of parallel surfaces on this side and that side. Okay, and it forms, most of these flat bones form the root of your skull. For example, your parietal bone right here from this portion of the skull. Your sternum right here is another good example of flat bone. Ribs are also another flat bone. Scapula, as you can see, this triangular shape on the back towards the posterior part of the body. Those are all examples of flat bones, and they usually provide protection for some underlying soft tissue area that needs that extra coverage overall over them. And then you have long bones, and as the name suggests, they are long in shape. They're long, slender, and usually located in the limbs area. It can be the upper arm, the forearm, the thigh, such as the femur, which actually is the largest and heaviest bone in the body compared to the rest of the skeleton. But even the finger bones right here are considered as long bones. So anything that kind of shapes like this right here is considered as long bone. Okay, and then the last two types of bones are short bones and sesamoid bones. Short bones, as its name suggests, they are short, so they form these box cube-like structure within, that particular area of the skeleton. And a good example of short bones are the carpal bones that forms your wrist and the tarsal bones that forms your ankles. They don't have to be all of the same size. They can be big like this, small like this, but they all kind of fit together in little short bones that form that particular area of the skeleton. Sesamoid bone is the last type of classification of shapes of bones that doesn't really fit into the other 5 shapes because they're they're small, but they're round. They have flat areas as well. So that's why there's a whole category for these type of bones called sesamoid bones. They're usually found near joints of your knees, hands, and feet. For example, your knee has this special bone called the patella bone, which is what we commonly known as the kneecap. So this is a good example of a sesamoid bone. Now, in lab, you will have to know a list of bone names from the skull all the way down to the toes. Now, you don't have to know every single bone that is listed in your lab manual, and hence, this is what I was saying when someone asked the question for lab purposes or lab practical purposes, should we focus on lab exercise PowerPoint versus the lab manual? You should focus on the lab exercise PowerPoint because we have narrowed down what you have to know for the lab practical. All the lab manual exercises actually includes a lot more information than what we require you to know. They would list a lot of bones, but we don't ask that you know all the bones. So basically, lab exercise itself is kind of narrowing down what you have to know for the lab practical. Okay? So for skeleton and bone names, we have narrowed down to a list of each part of the skeleton, whether bones or bone markings. And you will learn the specific names in lab. And so for lecture, I won't go over the specific names of each bone because you're not tested in the lecture portion. On the lecture exam, you don't have to expect, don't expect a picture of a bone and ask for the name of the bone. That's not for lecture exam. That is saved for lab practical. Okay? But I will go over a few of these common bone marking names with you because knowing these will give you an idea of where the bone should be or how the bone area should look like. Now, what I mean by bone marking versus bone is bone marking are usually those projections. So they can be projections or openings or depressions. Now, projections are those on the surface of the bones where muscles, tendons, and ligaments can attach to, or where adjacent bones come together to form joints. So, for example, if we look at the femur, you have the head of the femur, and then that side, and then you have this part. Okay, so it's this part, this protrusion. There's actually also little curvature area or notches on the bones like that. That's important for attachment of tendons and ligaments, for attachment of muscles for tendon's sake, and then for bone-to-bone connection for ligament's sake. And because we need those ropes to really tie those tightly, to either to stabilize a joint or make sure the muscle sticks to the bones, because we talked about how it is your muscles doing contraction that enables your bones to move. The bones itself cannot move. It is the contraction of muscles that's pulling the bones so you can, achieve movement. Now, on this end of the femur, you see these two curvatures. They are called condyles, actually, and they are curved that special way is because it is how it is able to fit into the other bone to form your knee joint, okay? So the other side of the tibia bone is actually have indentation where those curvatures of the condyles fit into that particular area of the tibia bone, okay? And you'll learn about that in lab. Now, the other type of bone markings there can be is openings and depression. Just as you have projections, there will be depressions as well. Openings is usually sites where blood vessels or nerves are trying to go into or penetrate the bone, okay? So, for example, we'll name a few here, such as foramen. Foramen usually means a hole of some sort through the bone in circular shape. So these are usually holes like this in a circular shape that allows particular blood vessel or nerve to go through. Okay, so for example, the optic foramen is for the optic nerve to go through and then towards your occipital lobe of the brain that we'll talk about later in the semester. Fissure, on the other hand, they're still an opening, but they're in shape of a slit instead of a circle. Okay, so what you see here in the orbital area, again, you have this slit here and then this slit here. The upper one is actually called superior orbital fissure. The lower one is called inferior orbital fissure. Okay, so that is not called foramen is because it is not a hole shape, but sort of a cleft, a slit shape. Okay, so that's what I mean by knowing the gist of these bone markings gives you an idea of how these bones supposed to shape like and how they're supposed to look like, and sometimes even where they're located. Okay, so go through these bone markings yourself. Okay, this is not going to be part of the lecture exam, but just something helpful for you to go over as part of your lab identification of bones. Here's one other good example, fossa. Fossa is a good example of a depression, whereas tuberosity is a good example of a projection. So opening, foramen fissure, and then you have depression. For example, right here, this particular area of the humerus bone, which is your upper arm, it's called the olecranon fossa. Okay, fossa meaning it has a big hole, okay, a depression of some sort. And there's a depression there. In this case, is because that's where your elbow joint, okay, formed by your ulna bone goes and fits into the humerus bone. There's actually an olecranon process of the ulna bone that shapes like this, and it fits directly into that particular depression area of the bone to give you and form your elbow joint so you can bend your arm, okay? And then tuberosity is a projection for attachment of muscles or other things, okay? So that's 2 examples of depression versus projection. So make sure you go through this, and it will be helpful for you in terms of identification of bones and bone marking. So bone is the actual bone name. For example, this is the bone name of this is called a femur. The bone name of this is called the humerus. But all these other stuff on it is called bone marking, okay? For example, condyle is a bone marking. Head is a bone marking, okay? All right. So the basic bone structure is divided into several parts. You have the diaphysis of the bone, which is usually, if we're talking about the structure of a long bone, diaphysis refer as to the shaft of the long bone or the long portion of the long bone. Usually it is a skinny, okay, tubular shaft, whereas epiphyses are either ends of the bones that are more irregular shaped like that. So epiphyses, you don't have to distinguish between proximal versus distal epiphysis. Just know at least epiphysis kind of, if it's because it starts with the E, for me, it tells me that it is the ends of the two ends of the bones. And then between diaphysis and epiphysis, you have something called the metaphysis that connects the diaphysis with the epiphysis. Okay, so that little middle portion there is the metaphysis. There are 2 basic types of tissue in bone structure. One is called the compact bone, which is more dense and solid and forms that sturdy protective layer that surrounds the empty space within the long bone called the medullary cavity. So this portion right here or right here that surrounds the medullary cavity is what compact bone is. It doesn't have holes, as you can see. It looks pretty solid, and it is what gives you strength of the bone to be able to withstand more pressure coming through on the bone. The other type of bone structure within bones is spongy bones. As his name suggests, it looks like sponge. If you look at this picture here, okay, it looks like a magnified version of what a sponge looks like. So spongy bones are usually located mostly within the epiphysis portion, okay? So if you look at the epiphysis here and the epiphysis here, you can likely see the little holes within the epiphyseal area. So those are representation of spongy bones. Okay, that's why there's holes in them, because it is a network usually of struts and plates that form some sort of 3D lattice structure that, is interconnected together like a little mesh. And hence the name for this particular type of bone is called trabecular bone. And trabecular is a good word to remember for that particular structure of that, interconnection meshwork okay, because we actually talk about trabecular layer of the heart, and this is where there's certain connective tissue layer within the heart that looks like has these holes and sponge-like mesh-like structure, okay? All right, and then within a flat bone, there's actually spongy bones as well, but we give it a different name called diploe. And the structure of flat bones is a little different, where we have a whole layer of compact bone on the exterior portions of the flat bone, either on the superior or the inferior portion. And then in between, you have these compact bones sandwiching your spongy bone in the middle. And this is what gives the strength of the flat bones against any shock, okay? So this is what basically protects your brain from damages. So remember, the spongy bones of these flat bones are given a special name called diploe. Now remember, bone tissue is considered as a type of connective tissue that we went over in chapter 4, and connective tissue includes specialized cells and matrices. Remember those ground substance we talked about, and then the different specialized cells, fibroblasts, mesenchymal cells, etc. So bone tissue also have specialized cells we learned called osteocytes in chapter 4, but there are actually more of those different cells. We'll talk about that in a bit, but let's talk about the bone matrix first. What makes up the bone matrix? For the bones, there are two main types of molecules within the bone matrix. One is inorganic portion, which is mainly made up of calcium phosphate, and then there's an organic portion that is made up of collagen fibers. The inorganic portion is, like I said, mainly made up of calcium phosphate. But there's also two other components, calcium hydroxide and calcium carbonate. And together they form these crystals called hydroxyapatite crystal. And for me personally, an easy way for me to remember, a good reminder, funny thing to remember for me is that it kind of sounds like appetite. Okay, so to me, hydroxyapatite sounds like, ooh, I have an appetite for chicken bones, for example. Now, I'm not saying that, chicken bones is something that you eat, but I'm just saying, part of anatomy is being able to come up with something that represents the meaning of all these different terminologies and information, that once you remember that little funny thing about that part, that term, then you'll never forget it again. Okay, so for me, hydroxyapatite, to me, I'll never forget again having an appetite for chicken bones. Okay, so it has something to do with the hardness of bones, which has to do with calcium. So calcium, or the inorganic portion, hydroxyapatite crystal, makes up about 2/3 of the bone's weight. And it is what makes the bone strong, allowing our bones to be able to withstand compression. So that's the function of the inorganic portion. Now, the organic portion is made up of protein fibers in connective tissues. And we talked about three types of fibers, your elastic, collagen, and reticular fibers. For bone tissue is mainly made up of collagen fibers because that's the strongest of the three types. They make up about 1/3 of the bone's weight, and they will provide a bit of flexibility so bones can withstand some twisting and bending. I'm not saying you can really bend someone's arm without breaking it, but at least, if someone was to accidentally kick you in the shin during a soccer game or something, not with cleats, I'm saying, accidentally kicking your shin a little bit with sneakers, for example, your bone won't just crack in half because someone just accidentally kicked you a little bit. Because collagen fibers is able to provide that bit of flexibility within the bone itself, okay, to minimize damages to the bone tissue. So both components of the bones are just as important, whether inorganic or the organic portion. Without hydroxyapatite, the calcium portion, bones would actually be too flexible, like it's shown in this image here, where you see this bone is just almost kind of like a straw, where it's flexible like that. Because it loses the strength of the bone itself without calcium. Remember, we talked about a condition called rickets in the last chapter and for the integumentary system. And rickets was what happens when you don't have enough calcium ion in the body. When you don't have enough calcium ion, you're not making these hydroxyapatite crystals, and your bones lose their source of strength. Okay, so that's why those people with rickets end up having curvy legs, is because just like how this chicken bone is being bent, that's what's happening to their bones as well, by the weight of their body putting pressure on their legs. Now, bones without collagen won't work either, because collagen is what provides the flexibility and that slight bend that can give, that slight give the bone is able to provide. So without collagen, bones will feel very brittle, and it will crack. It seems like it will crack with the slightest impact or bend. And when we actually have labs for this particular histology of the bone, we actually treat bones two different ways. One that removes the inorganic portion, which is the calcium, and one that removes the collagen fiber, which is the organic portion. And you can actually feel the differences of the two bones with either of those portions removed from the bone itself. Okay, and this is exactly what it feels like. The one without collagen, it feels more brittle. The ones without calcium feels more flexible and soft and squishy. All right, so just as I was talking about, bone tissue has specialized cells called osteocytes, but that's just one type of cells. There's actually 4 main types of cells in bones. The first of those is called osteogenic cells, and from its name, you already have an idea what it does. We talked about osteo, which usually indicates something to do with bone tissue, and genic means production or generation of. So these are cells that probably generate bones from what we know about the prefix and the suffix. And that is essentially what they do. Osteogenic cells are a type of mesenchymal cells. And remember, we talked about mesenchymal cells being a type of stem cells that can differentiate into osteoblasts for regeneration of bone tissues. Osteoblast is the other type of cells we'll talk about next that is important for building bones. So that is why these osteogenic cells are important, because they are what's going to be helping us repair a fracture. And that's the whole part about regeneration. It's not just as an embryo, we need stem cells to form all these different parts of the body from scratch. But also as an adult, we need these stem cells because some parts of our body are constantly regenerating, or there are cells that ages and we need to improve them, or we replace them. Kind of like how with our skin cells we have the stratum basale layer, and there's a type of stem cells within there called basal cells for regeneration of keratinocytes. Okay, and that's basically the idea with bones, where we have osteogenic cells for replacement of bone tissues. Now, osteogenic cells are usually found in the inner layer of 2 parts of the bone. Okay, you have periosteum. Okay, periosteum, as the name suggests, peri, remember I talked about that. Peri means on the outside, so kind of remember as perimeter of something, the outside layer. So periosteum is that outer layer of the bone, and endosteum is what lines the inner layer or the medullary cavity of the bone. And it just kind of makes sense that this is where osteogenic cells are, is because the osteogenic cells is to either repair or grow bones. So that's why being on the outer or the inner layer is, what makes sense for them to live in, okay? And we'll talk about details of these 2 layers of the bones in a bit. Okay, so the second type of bone cells are called osteoblasts. These are bone cells that are important for producing new bone matrix in a process called osteogenesis or ossification. Now, the way I remember osteoblasts and never forget what they do is I will remember osteoblasts has a B in it. Blast starts with a B. So for me, B stands for bone building, okay? Building. So osteoblast, I will never forget that it is for bone building or bone making process, okay? So osteoblast will actually, make proteins and other organic components along with depositing calcium salts to make the bone matrix. The third type of cells, which actually is the majority of the cells within bone tissue, are the mature bone cells, and they are called osteocytes. Cytes usually stands for cells, and then osteo for bone. So these are bone cells. Now, these mature bone cells actually occupy every little pocket between the layers of the bone tissue, and those pockets we already mentioned in chapter 4. They're called lacuna in singular form or lacunae for plural form. And only one osteocyte occupies one lacuna. They don't share those little pockets. Only one cell occupies each little pockets. Now, the osteocytes themselves actually can't do any cell division, but as we have discussed, osteogenic cells can differentiate to form more osteoblasts, and osteoblasts can then become trapped within the bone matrix and turn into osteocytes. So that's how we can generate more osteocytes, even if they end up being destroyed or broken down or anything happens to them, okay? So if you remember from the microscopic view of the bone tissue from chapter 4, This was how an osteon looks like. I also always like to refer to them to like it looks like a log that's been transverse cut, that had a transverse cut where you see rings of the log. So bone osteons kind of looks like that, where you have rings like this, and then you saw that there were dots on those rings, these black dots area. So those black dots are the lacuna where the osteocytes are living in them. Okay. Now, in order for each osteocyte to access nutrients from blood vessels within the bone or to communicate with other osteocytes, there are tiny passageways between them called canaliculi. And that's, with canaliculi, for me, the easy way to remember it is it starts with the word canal, which means it serves as a passageway for something to go through. And in this case, for blood to go through or for communication, methods to go through, okay? Some sort of communication substance, okay? So that's why on the microscopic view of these bone tissue, it almost looks like little spider webs coming out of these cells because of the existence of these canaliculi. So going back to my drawing here of the osteon, in addition to those lacuna, you saw these squiggly things coming out. Kind of ends up looking like little bugs on the bone tissue, but they are not little bugs. Those little lines are what this cartoon image here is trying to depict, with the little canaliculi coming out of each lacuna so that the osteocytes can either get nutrients from the blood vessel within the central canal or communication with other osteocytes. Now, there are two main functions of the osteocytes that they serve. One is to maintain protein and mineral content of the matrix, protein, the collagen, fiber, mineral, the calcium. And the mineral content of the matrix is actually constantly being broken down and to release the minerals within the bone and also remade into hydroxyapatite. So this whole process of regeneration, breaking down and remaking bone tissue is actually called bone remodeling, that we will talk about towards the end of the chapter. And kind of just like how we consistently generate skin cells, we're also consistently generating bone tissue, but it's just that the speed at which we're replacing bone tissue can differ by body locations depending how often bones are rubbing against each other, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the chapter. The second main function that osteocytes do is they can actually repair damaged bones if they're released from the lacuna and converted back into an osteoblast or osteogenic cells. Now, this is something interesting with bone cells, is that, stem cells can differentiate into something such as osteocyte, and an osteocyte can actually backtrack into an osteoblast or osteogenic cells. Most of the times with stem cells is that once they become their targeted tissue, we call that process differentiation. They stay there. You can't turn target a somatic cell back into a stem cell. Okay, for example, cardiac muscle cell, once that particular stem cell as an embryo has become a cardiac muscle cell, it stays as a cardiac muscle cell. It doesn't turn back into a cardiac stem cell. We wanted to do that, then if we discover such a thing, then we can, help a lot of patients with heart attacks that has dead cardiac muscle tissues that we can't replenish and regenerate. So, and hence that's why it's something special with bone cells, that they can go back and forth this way. So the last type of bone cells are called osteoclast cell, and which they function to absorb and remove bone matrix. Now, how do I remember osteoclast? The difference between osteoclast and osteoblast is that osteoclast begins with the letter C in the class. Okay, so for me, C means cutting away bones. It's not really cutting away bones, but that's how it helped me in my mind to distinguish the function of osteoblast and osteoclast. Osteoblast, B for bone building, osteoclast for cutting away and breaking down the bone tissue. So that's an easy way. And once you know, you remember something that helps you, memorize the function of certain parts or terms, okay, you will never forget it again. So with these osteoclasts, they actually occupy a different type of pocket. They don't live in those normal lacuna that the osteocytes live in. They live in special large pockets called the house-shaped lacuna, which are basically bigger pockets, like a bigger apartment for these cells, because these bone cells are actually the largest of the 4 types of bone cells. As you can see here, this is an osteoclast and how they look like, and they can contain up to 50 or more nuclei inside their cytoplasm. So this is what makes them so large, okay? And the other unique feature they have is a ruffle border. So you see this part on the edge of the cell, they kind of look like this, okay? Remember, I keep mentioning about microvilli. And microvilli has these curvatures for expanding the surface area of the cell. And expanding surface area, remember I said that usually indicates is a location of the body that has a lot of absorption and or secretion. And in this case, osteoclast is doing both. It's secreting a type of acid that can actually dissolve the matrix, and once the bone matrix is dissolved, it releases all these calcium ions and minerals, which then will be absorbed by the osteoclasts and onto the circulatory system if there's an area of the body that needs more calcium. Okay, so it's for secreting acids and releasing those stored minerals. And the whole process of breaking down bones is called osteolysis. Osteo, remember, for bone, lysis for breaking down. Okay, so remember, osteoclast is for breaking down bones, cutting away bones by releasing that acid and also reabsorbing all the minerals back. And now osteolysis, remember, is the opposite of osteogenesis. So in a sense, osteoblast is for osteogenesis, osteoclast is for osteolysis. Now, again, that ruffle border is what's providing that nice surface area for the function of these particular cells in the bone tissue. Okay, microscopically speaking, the compact bone has all these organized little structures that we need to talk about. So for example, here in this picture is looking at a cross section of a long bone, for example, and the compact bone portion of the long bone is this area right there, whereas this area is actually the trabeculate spongy bone. So this compact bone here is what we're going to break down into little parts and make sure you know the different parts' name. So like I was saying, on the bone tissue, microscopically, they have these single basic units of bone tissue called the osteon, which was represented by, for example, what I was saying, a log, cross-section of a tree log, or because it looks like that, with these concentric circle around them. And then inside there is a central canal. So these are either called osteon or Haversian system. So the osteocytes, because they live in the lacuna, and you can see these little dots here that represents the lacuna, they are arranged in those concentric layers around the central canal. And the central canal, also called Haversian canal, is for containing the blood vessels that carry blood to and from the osteon vertically down the compact bone. So these are the central canals that go down vertically the compact bone. In addition to central canals vertically, there are also horizontal canals called perforating canals. That is for supplying blood deeper into the bone tissue. So here are those horizontal perforating canals that ensures all the bones, even those osteocytes within here, are able to get as much of the nutrients from the blood vessel. So the bone matrix actually forms concentric layers called lamellae. And this is where the collagen fibers is adding strength and resiliency of the compact bone structure. And there are actually 3 different types of lamellae. You have your interstitial lamellae, concentric lamellae, and circumferential lamellae. I'm going to draw this really quick for you here. So remember I said that the bone tissue ends up looking like little logs that are next to each other, and they form these circles around each other. And then what encircles them is another more multiple layers of bone tissues. Within each osteon, there are layers of bone tissue, and in the center, there are central canals. So there are 3 different types of layers we're seeing here. This concentric circle that forms the part of your osteon is called concentric lamellae. And then these portion here, because osteons are circles, if you stack circles together, you're bound to have spaces in between, but we're talking about formation of compact bone here. And compact bone is supposed to be dense and solid and gives the bone its resiliency. So we can't afford to have gaps and holes in between the osteon. So that's why there's a different type of lamellae between the osteon called interstitial lamellae. Okay, lamellae. That's an E. And then on top of that surrounds the entire bone, and in the circumference wise, its name says for itself, it's called circumferential lamellae. So this is one that wraps around the entire bone. For example, if we're looking at a cross section of a bone, remember the periosteum, endosteum, medullary cavity, and you have that whole bone. So we're talking about those lamellae that surrounds the entire circumference of the cross section of the bone. So that's what I'm trying to draw here. Okay, so remember these 3 different types of lamellae and how to distinguish them. Their name actually kind of speaks for what they are and where they're located. And it's good to remember interstitial. Interstitial usually mean in between things, kind of like package material, other than interstitial growth that we'll talk about in terms of bone growth. Okay. So spongy bone, on the other hand, do not have all that organized structure like we were talking about with compact bone. They don't have, first of all, osteons. There are no osteon in spongy bone, and is not, as dense as compact bone. And that's why you see these holes here in this magnified picture within the epiphyses of the long bone. You see these fibers that are crossed with each other, forming these holes within the structure, and that's what makes up the spongy bone, or your trabeculate bone within the spongy bone, which is basically a meshwork of those supporting fibers that interconnect with each other. So spongy bones, because it's not densely packed, they can withstand some compression, but it's just not for that strong resilience and pressure. So spongy bones are usually found within areas that are not heavily stressed. They also have no capillaries because there's no perforating canal or central canal for these spongy bones, but they do contain the red bone marrow within the trabeculate bone, which means they are located within the epiphyses of long bones or interior part of large bones, and they're usually protected by that framework of trabeculate. Okay, so there exists red bone marrow within the epiphyses or spongy bones of a bone structure. Okay, so the structure of compact bone and spongy bone we just went over actually work together to distribute the weight so that most of the stress that is exerted on the compact bone, for example, in the case of a femur right here, if we look at the distribution of weight, the body weight is an applied force that goes through the spongy bone of the epiphysis to the compact bone of the femoral shaft right here. At the distal epiphyses, which is right here, the trabeculae would then transfer the weight from the shaft toward the leg via the knee joint. So the way that this femur is designed is that we're distributing all that weight through spongy bones towards the compact bones and then redistribute it again in the spongy bone, so that this compact bone portion of the femur is able to withstand all that weight coming from the weight of our body, the trunk of our body. So if the force was to be forced upon the medullary cavity, then we're in trouble, because then there's none of that dense area for supporting all that weight. So the way that, bones are shaped, the way that we have these two different structure of bones is all meant to be so that we can have a good sort of this distribution of weight towards for us to be able to stand upright and uphold our body. Okay. So as mentioned earlier, our bones have two coverings. One is on the outside, the other is on the inside. The outside layer is what surrounds the superficial layers of compact bone, is called the periosteum. Other than joint cavities, it also covers all the superficial layer of compact bones. So here in this, this picture here where there's this forceps trying to peel a layer away from bone tissue, this right here is the periosteum. It also functions to isolate bones from surrounding tissues, provides a route for blood vessels and nerves to go through, and takes part in bone growth and repair as well. Another feature of periosteum is that they contain what's called perforating fibers, which are interwoven with those of tendons to attach muscles to bone and make sure those bonds between these features are even stronger. So here's an example of perforating fibers here, and here's another perforating fiber. So it's kind of like if you imagine you have thread and needle and you're just weaving in and out to sew together this periosteum with the bone tissue to make that bonding really, really tight together. That's what perforating fibers are. It's kind of like this thread going through and reinforcing the attachment. The endosteum is an incomplete cellular layer. Now, what we mean by incomplete is that you see that these are cells that make up the endosteum, but they're not continuous. They can be broken up in between with osteoclasts or osteogenic cells. Remember, osteoclasts are breaking down bones, and a lot of times they're breaking down bones from the interior side of the bone. And there's also osteogenic cells for replenishing the bone structure, regeneration of bone structure. So that's why they call the endosteum an incomplete cellular layer that lines the inner cavity, the medullary cavity of the bones. Usually they're active during bone growth, repair, and remodeling. The endosteum is also what covers trabeculae of spongy bones. This is where osteoblasts and osteoclasts, like I was saying, are building and breaking down bone matrix components. So here's a short video that goes over the basic bone structure that we have discussed. Okay, it's kind of slow where it goes, movement of some 3D animation of the different parts of the bone, but it gives you that really good view of those basic structure of the compact bone we're talking about. What is an osteon, what is spongy bones compared to compact bones, how the central canal looks like, and how do where those osteocytes live. Okay, so it's a good short animation video.
The human skeleton gives the body its shape and provides physical support for the systems contained within. It also forms part of the musculoskeletal system that enables us to move. The structure of bone is optimized so that it is strong but relatively lightweight. The interior of bone is composed of bone marrow. It is surrounded by two major types of bone tissue. Cortical bone, or the hard outer shell of bone, and trabecular bone, the spongy-looking center. The amount of each type of tissue in bone is dependent on the function of that bone. The basic unit of cortical or compact bone is the osteon. It is composed of successive concentric lamellae. This structure contributes to bone strength by resisting bending. Cells called osteocytes are distributed within the concentric lamellae. Osteocytes form a complex network that is thought to be important in maintaining the viability and structural integrity of bone. At the center of the osteon is the Haversian canal. These canals contain blood vessels and nerves. The blood vessels within bone facilitate the exchange between osteocytes and the blood. Trabecular bone is present in the interior of some bones and resists compression. Osteocytes are also contained within its structure and again play an important role in sensing local changes in strain. Trabeculae are covered in a layer of flattened lining cells that are thought to be involved in the dynamic process by which bone is formed and broken down. Bone marrow is found within the interior of bones. The surrounding trabeculae and vascular network provide structural support, nutrition, and a waste removal system for the heterogeneous group of cells found within this space. Bone marrow is a site for hematopoiesis, the process by which the cellular components of blood are formed.
But those last type of cells you're seeing are examples of white blood cells, showing you that those hematopoietic stem cells actually makes and replenish our white blood cells and red blood cells. So that was a good video that gives us a glimpse of sort of the tour of our compact bone and spongy bone. So next we'll talk about the formation of bones. How are bones formed? Okay, so there are bones formation, like we were saying, is term ossification, formation of bone. Calcification is the deposit of calcium salts within to form bone tissue. So calcification is what's required to happen for ossification to happen. So there are actually two different processes of ossification needs to happen. One is for formation of long bones and the other is formation of flat bones. We'll first go over the formation of long bones process, and it is called endochondral ossification. So this is when the main thing that comes with endochondral ossification is the bones replacing existing cartilage. So you kind of begin the process of long bone formation with the cartilage model. So if you think about an embryo that came from a ball of cells, and each of those cells will then become, of course, specialized in becoming muscle cells, bone cells, skin cells. So we're talking about formation of long bones from scratch in that way. And so usually this involves forming ossification centers. One is called primary ossification center. The other is called secondary ossification center. And I'll talk about in what step of the process that these come into play. So in an embryo, long bones first begin as the cartilage model that looks like this. And it is usually made up of hyaline cartilage. Remember, we talked about that. There are three main types of cartilage. You have elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, and hyaline cartilage, with hyaline cartilage being most abundant in the body, and it also serves as, in this case, the beginning of your long bones. So your beginning of your long bone is shaped by your hyaline cartilage. And then remember the cells of cartilage is called chondrocytes, and chondrocytes within the center or around the diaphysis of the long bone area is going to enlarge in the middle and actually disintegrate to leave small little cavities or holes within the cartilage itself. And then blood vessels will then grow around the edges of the cartilage, and they will convert into osteoblasts. Remember, I'll show you in a minute of another video showing the endochondrial ossification, where it shows blood cells coming from these blood vessels will then deliver osteoblasts, and osteoblasts will then start depositing bone tissue within the superficial covering of the diaphysis of the bone. So this is why you're seeing formation of this yellowish layer around that area, is because it's forming that thin layer of bone tissue. And then blood vessels will then penetrate into the center of the diaphysis and form something called the primary ossification center, because the bone cells will then start growing from this center outwards to complete the formation of the basic precursor of the diaphysis shaft of the long bone. Fibroblasts will also be there to form collagen fibers like we were talking about in tissue chapter. And then subsequent remodeling in this last step of the primary ossification center is what allows the growth of the diaphysis to create this medullary cavity within the inner compartment of the bones for storage of red marrow and yellow marrow. The shaft, the osseous bone within the shaft actually then becomes thicker, as you're seeing, compared with the superficial bone in the previous step. And eventually then you will focus bone building in the epiphysis area. So you see these two areas, and you see these dots in the blue area and also yellowish area. So these dots as blue area is the cartilage, okay, which are the chondrocytes within that area. And this specific area is actually called the epiphyseal cartilage, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But what happens is that bone cells will continue growing this way and this way, okay, and replace those cartilage cells. More cartilage will form this way, and bone cells will catch up and take over and destroy those cartilage and turn them into bone cells. And that's how our bone is able to grow in length, and that is specifically called interstitial growth, okay, which means growth in length, and it involves formation of another ossification center called the secondary ossification center. So the primary ossification center involves the formation of the diaphysis shaft, and then to continue to growth, you need to form these secondary ossification center where capillaries can penetrate into that area and starts forming bone within the center of that epiphysis. Now, for interstitial growth to occur, like I was saying, you have this layer of epiphyseal cartilage, and then you have bone cells that will catch up either this way or this way, okay, to finish up this process, okay? So the interstitial growth is mainly happening in this area where you have chondrocytes or cells of the cartilage keep growing this way, and then you have bone cells that continue to overtake and grow and destroy cartilage and turn them into bone cells, actually replace them with bone cells. And that equal weight of cartilage formation and bone formation is what keeps the bone to grow in length. So this is what that same rate means, talking about same rate of cartilage cells being produced at this end, epiphyseal cartilage end, and then same rate of bone cell formation going towards the epiphyseal cartilage. Now, what needs to happen after puberty is that we can't keep growing until we're like 10 feet tall in cases of, for example, gigantism that we'll talk about in the last part of the chapter. We have to stop growing at some point. So at puberty, it is already designed where the rate of epiphyseal cartilage would actually slow down, decreases in rate, and the rate of osteoblast activity will accelerate or greatly increase, which which means the growth of cartilage going this way will slow down. So it's kind of slowly growing a little bit, whereas the bone cells replacing the cartilage cells gets even faster, okay? It gets faster and faster and faster until it completely overtakes those chondrocytes within the epiphyseal cartilage area. And when those bone tissue completely closes off all the epiphyseal cartilage, we call that an epiphyseal closure, okay? An epiphyseal closure actually creates something called the epiphyseal line, okay? And something interesting with this epiphyseal line is that, for example, if we were to dig up some human remains in terms of bones from an area, and forensic science actually will look at the bones to give you an idea of some information about the bones, and one thing they look for is existence of this epiphyseal line. If an epiphyseal line exists in the bones, then that means at least we know this is either an adult or a teenager that has already reached their optimal height. Okay, so that whole length of the skeleton can then give a good idea of the height of this person. Now, if the bones don't have this epiphyseal line, then it's a good indication that these skeletal remains are from those of a child, or a child that is still growing in length and haven't actually reached the end of their puberty yet. But technically speaking, for everyone, by the time we reach puberty, epiphyseal closure happens, and that is when interstitial growth will stop. Okay, so now it's about an hour. So I will upload this animation video actually on eCampus, because the last 2 times I tried to play it, it actually automatically stopped my recording without saving it. So this is my 3rd time speaking through this lecture actually. So I'm not going to take the chance again and play this video. I'm going to stop it here in part 1 and upload this ossification video as another supplementary video on eCampus. Okay, and we'll come back in part 2 to talk about formation of flat bones in another process.